right. So I'm like really impressed that you're here on a Saturday morning to talk about the 6 objects that were selected by the Curriculum Review Committee to represent this hemispheric region that really begins in the late 15th century through the late 19th century. The works that were selected don't represent the entire span of what we call the colonial period, but when I was looking at which objects I could choose to provide some kind of representation of the material, I started in the 16th century. So one of them 16th century, 2 I believe are 17th century, and then 2 are 18th century. And most of them are from New Spain, most of the objects. 5 of them are from New Spain. 1 of them is from Peru. Okay, there was another work from Peru that we wanted to get, but they weren't able to get copyright permission, so it wasn't included. There's actually a 7th work that is from Peru that is included in the indigenous section. It's one of these works that falls right at that period of transition. It's a Christian church, a Catholic church that was built on top of the Inca temple. And my colleague on the Curriculum Review Committee, Rebecca Stone, decided to include it in the indigenous section to focus more on the Inca foundation, but it can also be included actually in this section because of the church that was built in the 17th century on top of the former Inca temple. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that towards the end. So what I'd like to do today is I've titled my presentation all about Latin American art history, understanding colonial arts of New Spain and Peru. I would like to begin by making some general comments about art history and the place of Latin American art within the larger discipline. And then I want to say a few things about colonial art history, the subfield of colonial art history, to kind of provide some context. You know, before I start jumping into the objects, I want to flesh out more historical and cultural context. So when I start engaging the 6 objects, I'm also including other objects to compare them with. I want you to have some more sense of the context. It's one of the things that has been getting back to me, especially with the new material, is that it's overwhelming for individuals who are not familiar with this, and the context kind of suffers a little. You know, what you have is the work that's included, and I know AP's been working on hiring consultants to write up sort of informative descriptions and summaries, which I've looked at, and they seem really, really good. But there's a lot more that we can say about this period and the work that was produced. So I'm going to try to fill in some of those blanks today and answer any questions you may have. So let's see if this is working. Here we go. So Latin American art history, just generally, is divided into 3 major components that are chronological. Okay, I'm going to break it down how these things are organized. We start with what's known by various labels, pre-Columbian, which has been problematized because of its focus on Columbus. So then we have pre-Hispanic, ancient, or pre-contact. So in the literature, if you do research or read about this material, you will come across any one of these terms. And they all refer to the same long period of indigenous art production in the Americas before European contact. So these different terms refer basically to the same historical and cultural context before European contact, starting in the late 15th century with the arrival of Columbus and then the Spanish and the Caribbean. So pre-Columbian, pre-Hispanic, ancient, pre-contact. That area, it tends to be organized first by geography. And so you have like Mesoamerica, and the Andes, Central America. So that's the first kind of category. That's how it's defined. And then within each geographical area, then it's divided by culture. So for Mesoamerica, you have the Aztec and the Maya. For the Andes, you would have the Inca and the Moche or Chavin. And then it's chronological for each culture. Then there's a chronology for each culture. That's different, of course. And then within that, then you have the medium, if it's metalwork or if it's textile. So the ancient material is organized in this order. When we move to the point of contact, of course, Columbus arrives in 1492. He wasn't lost. He just didn't know the Americas were there. He thought it was a straight shot to Asia. But when he arrives in the Caribbean, or what today is the Caribbean, I mean, throughout his entire life, he thought he was in Asia. It's not until his son grows up and is appointed governor of Cuba that Diego, it's during that period that they realize it's not Asia, that it's a brand new continent. We really, although most colonial courses and colonial texts start with the so-called conquest of Mexico, which occurs between 1519 and 1521, we really need to start earlier in the Caribbean. with the arrival of the Spanish. So we start with Columbus in 1492. The first Spanish city is founded in the Americas in 1496, and that's on the island of Hispaniola. What today is the Dominican Republic and Haiti. Okay, and that's in 1496. So I always start my classes when I teach the broader range of colonial art history with 1496 and the foundation of the first city, which that's what I'm going to write right now. It's Santo Domingo. It's still the capital. It's still there, and today it's the capital of the Dominican Republic. Okay, so that's when we officially start. With that context and with the foundation, this opens up the Americas. This becomes the first major port to the Americas that then leads to exploration, conquest, and settlement of the mainland on the continent. So when we talk about this period of contact and what follows over the next few centuries, again, there are multiple terms that have been used. Colonial is the most common term. Viceregal is sort of the term that's popular in Latin America to refer to this historical period. We also talk about early modernity, the early modern Americas, or post-contact. Okay, that material is organized, first of all, by geography. So we talk about viceroyalties. So it's like either New Spain or it's Peru. I'm going to kind of break that down. There are two other viceroyalties, Nueva Granada. I'll write these on the board. I can't remember if I have a slide with that. So the first viceroyalty that was established was New Spain, and that was established in 1535. And I think I brought some maps. That includes not just what is today Mexico. I don't like the term colonial Mexico because contemporary Mexico is much smaller than New Spain. New Spain included the entire southwest and west of what today is the US, Mexico, and all of Central America. It was a large territory. And then we have Peru. That was established in 1542, shortly after New Spain, as the Spaniards are moving south. Okay? And these are the two main viceroyalties throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. Okay, I'm going to talk about the political situation. In the 16th and 17th century, we can look at that as one phase that is ruled by the Austrian Habsburgs. The Austrian Habsburgs are on the Spanish throne at the time of this period of exploration and conquest. So I refer to this as the Habsburg period. So during the Habsburg period, they ruled throughout the 16th and 17th century. There are two viceroyalties, New Spain and Peru. In the 18th century, in 1700, the last Austrian Habsburg dies without an heir. And we have, I'm going to go into more detail shortly, what's called the War of Succession for the Spanish throne. And the French Bourbon family arrives at the Spanish throne. So then we have what I consider to be a second period of colonialism, and that's the Bourbon, the French Bourbon period, which is 18th and early 19th or 19th century. Since we're talking about Cuba, that goes until 1898. It's the 18th and 19th centuries. When the Bourbons come into power, they restructure the territories. And Peru, they break Peru down into three territories. That is, they add two more viceroyalties. The viceroyalty of Nueva Granada in 1717, and then the viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata in South America, what today's Argentina, Bolivia, Uruguay, Rio de la Plata, and that's in 1776. It's very late. It's not around very long. But what they do, and these were parts of the viceroyalty of Peru, but they decided to break Peru down. So we have Nueva Granada in what today is Colombia and Venezuela and Panama in the north. Peru remains in the center, and then the southern territories that were also part of Peru are broken off into their own viceroyalty, Rio de la Plata. Okay? So going back to this, so we start with, when I talk about geography in the colonial period, these are the main geographic sort of categories. It's the viceroyalties. And within each viceroyalty, it has its own chronology, depending on when the Spanish arrived, when the conquest and settlement occurred, and then each viceroyalty has a distinct history, a distinct chronology. Within that, then we look at medium. We're talking about painting, architecture, sculpture. It's very familiar. And then within that, then we look at artists. We're talking about painting, then each viceroyalty has its own group of artists. If we're talking about architecture, the same thing. So that's how the colonial period is organized. The 19th century, I included that in there because the 19th century kind of gets lost, between the colonial and the modern period, because it straddles the late colonial and early republican or nationalism. So it's kind of its own area. And within the study of Latin American art history, as most of us are familiar, people may know something about the Maya, maybe the Aztec, and then it's De Rivera and Frida Kahlo. 500 years disappear, and the 19th century, it lags in terms of scholarly attention. Most scholarship is done in pre-Columbian or modern. Okay, those are like the top two. Colonial's a little bit behind in scholarship, and then the 19th century has very few people. It's an area that needs more work. But I decided to include it in there with a little asterisk because it's kind of its own area, the 19th century. And we can talk about it in terms of post-independent period, Republican period, 19th century, early nationalism. Okay, and it's done by geography. That's how the area is organized. So we go by country in this case, like Mexico has its own early national post-independent history, Peru, Argentina, et cetera. It's done by country. And then chronology again. Each country, Mexico has its own history, dating, medium, and artist again. The third major area is modern. We can talk, it starts typically in the late 19th into the 20th century. And this is done again by nation, then chronology, medium, and artist. All right. And I added contemporary at the end. It kind of gets appended to the modern, but it's kind of its own area as well, 'cause it's not really historical. And of course, nations and national identity kind of falls to the wayside when we talk about contemporary art. It tends to have a much more transnational kind of character to it. So it's really by artist, and of course, medium, geography. So people who work on the contemporary focus on artists specifically. That's sort of the main defining or organizing category. So this is how Latin American art history is organized, and we're going to be focusing today more closely on the second section, colonial, viceregal, early modern, post-contact. And here I'm just naming or giving examples of these. So when we talk about geography again, it's by viceroyalty, and then within each viceroyalty, we look at cities. And for New Spain, and this is one of the problems with colonial art history, is that it's very Mexico-centric. Okay, other areas are marginal in the scholarship. In the last 20 years, people have been starting to look at Peru a little more. So that's like a growing area. But like the Caribbean, Central America, there's like no work. I mean, there are a huge lacuna when we talk about colonial Central America. One of my PhD students is sort of making a name for himself as a Caribbean colonial art historian, so things are starting to change. Central America, no one looks at colonial Central America. That's an area that needs a lot of work, and actually that's where I'm going to be focusing my research after I'm done with my next book. So when we talk about the colonial period, these are the examples. New Spain, Peru, Nueva Granada, Rio de la Plata. We can throw in also these other territories that weren't viceroyalties, but they were like supplementary territories, what are called capitanías generales, or in English, captaincy generals. These are small territories that are governed by the larger viceroyalties. So it's like Cuba, Puerto Rico, the islands in the Caribbean, Hispaniola. But we can also talk about Guatemala, which in the colonial period was the entirety of Central America. And it's not until the 19th century that Guatemala is broken down into the countries we know today. So these are the geographic areas, and then within each geographic area, again, then we have the cities. This is where the majority of art production occurs, or at least what's been studied. So for New Spain, it's Mexico City. And this is a problem because New Spain was huge. And there are other cities where there were artists making art. But for a number of reasons, Mexico City's been the main focus. For definitely the Mexican art historians. They're all in Mexico City working at the institute. They focus on Mexico City. That was the imperial capital. There was a lot of money there. The vice-regal court is there. Art's patronage is huge. So all of the canonical work, really the canonical works of colonial art history relating to Mexico are from Mexico City. That's really the focal point. Although other scholars are starting to look at other areas of New Spain, such as where we are now, what were called the northern provinces, like in Texas and New Mexico, Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, and parts of Utah. For Peru, Lima and Cusco are the two dominant cities, although we do have art like schools further south in what today is Bolivia. but Lima and Cusco are sort of the leading cities, like Mexico City, in terms of art production. Further south, Potosí, which was a mining town. There's a lot of wealth there. Arts take off, art production as a result of this wealth. In the Caribbean, Havana becomes the leading city. Okay, in Cuba. In Central America, we have Antigua and Guatemala. Guatemala is kind of an interesting case, but it's one of these areas that hasn't been researched a lot. But we know that there was a very strong sculptural tradition coming out of Guatemala. And then when we talk chronology, although the Spanish begin to arrive in the late 15th century, you'll see that most colonial art historical works start in the 16th century. So primarily the 16th century, 17th, 18th, and then into the 19th. Okay, the colonial period doesn't end. And that's another problem. When I said that it's Mexico-centric, it's not just the focus on Mexico and Mexico City, it's that the chronology for colonial art history tends to reflect Mexico's history, not the rest of the Americas. So typically you'll see 1521, which is the year associated with the conquest of Mexico, to 1821, which is the year of Mexico's independence. But those dates are Mexico-specific. They don't reflect the dates in Peru or Cuba. I mean, colonialism in Cuba goes through the 19th century until 1898. Same thing with Brazil, which is Portuguese. It's different, but that's in the late 19th century. So we can stretch Spanish colonialism all the way into the late 19th century, since Cuba is the final colonial territory that Spain relinquishes. So these are the main centuries. And then, of course, in terms of the arts, this is where we're starting to see some changes, because there are certain types of colonial art that don't quite fit sort of European categories of art production.
I'm very embarrassed to ask this question, but I look up there and I see the first category, and then I see the Mexico City, and I see Lima and Cusco, but I know those aren't in Mexico City. And then I get down to Havana, which I know is in Cuba, but
Right.
that's up with me.
Right.
So why are they next to Mexico?
Yeah, that's what I was just explaining, or trying to explain, that these are the main cities. When we talk about colonial art history, Mexico City and New Spain.
Those are all main
Yeah,
cities.
these are the main cities.
Got it.
So when we talk about geography, we start with viceroyalties, and then within the viceroyalties, these are the cities that are the focus, for art historical interest. This is where all the workshops were located. All the major artists are working in the main cities. That's where the money is. And these cities are also administrative centers, so that's where we see a lot of productivity, and that's where scholars tend to focus. Not that art wasn't being produced elsewhere, but that's where the scholars tend to focus.
Just one baby question, it's not part of the lecture, but when your students come to you, do you find them knowledgeable? Do you find them completely a blank slate? Are they mixed? What do you do?
Most are blank slates, and then there's some, because I teach at the University of New Mexico, there is a very strong colonial cultural presence there. The families of the original settlers, the Spanish, are still there, same way I grew up in Texas, so there is sort of this general understanding or familiarity of the history. And also colonial culture is infused in the local culture, in the architecture, especially New Mexico. Same thing where I grew up in South Texas and San Antonio, so we grow up with some understanding of this history and culture because it's our history and culture. Also, University of New Mexico is one of the top Hispanic serving institutions in the nation, so the students have some level of familiarity. So in terms of art history, they're usually blank slates unless they've had my colleagues' courses. But in terms of this material, usually this is an introduction to them. But they have some general idea, of settlement patterns and of the culture and the architecture.
It'd be interesting to see how that changes as this curriculum has changed.
Yeah.
I think so too.
Yeah, well, it just seems important. We're talking about 75 to 80% of the Western Hemisphere over close to a 500-year period. And one of the things that becomes evident as we move into the 18th and 19th century is that what today we see as the border really wasn't there, and there were a lot of exchanges between New Spain and the British colonies. When I get later to the late 18th century, for example, New Spain, following Spain's request, supported the American Revolution. Spain supported troops to kick the British out of the southeast. Because of course it behooved Spain to get the other European nations out of the picture. Okay, it had its own imperial designs in terms of expansion. So Spain supported the American Revolution, and the viceroy, or the governor of Louisiana, who later becomes the viceroy, Bernardo de Galvez, he provides troops and helps the Americans kick the British out from the southeast and east. So there are actually sculptures of this noble Hispanic viceroy in D.C. There's a sculpture dedicated to Galvez. I've seen sculptures of him in New Orleans, because he was the governor there. He's very much part of that history. Galveston in Texas, the city's named after him. So there are more connections between these territories, and most people are aware. But in any case, but then going back to sort of genre, so painting, the typical, what you would expect. These are European artistic practices that are imported or brought to the Americas. But once these sort of artistic practices are brought to the Americas, they are inflected by pre-existing native cultures and their artistic practices. So one of the things that we start seeing very early is that these European models are altered. You know, the term hybrid has been used, although it's been critiqued in recent years, sort of to characterize these works that have elements that are European, kind of blended with elements that are native, producing these new cultural forms we've never seen before. That becomes a hallmark of the 16th century, especially when there's first contact. Okay, so, but in the meantime, we can still talk about architecture, of course. There are churches and missions being built. There are civic buildings. Eventually, there are palaces for the developing aristocracy that develops. Painting, as we know, of course, religious painting, conversion, religion. The church is a very important regulatory mechanism in colonialism. So churches require images and sculptures. So there's painting and sculpture on panel, later canvas. Decorative arts, what are considered to be perhaps a lower art form in Europe, are very important. One of the most important vehicles for painting are these Japanese-inspired screens, the biombos. Very important. They kind of straddle the line between furniture and works of fine art. And in the colonial context, they are works of fine art. They're a very important vehicle for painting in the domestic space. And I'm going to show you some additional examples of biombos. Prints. You know, the first printing press arrives in the 1530s. There are two main printing presses that are brought to the Americas in the 16th century, and print production takes off, as well as book production. That's a whole area of study, colonial prints and colonial book production. It's also an area that needs more work. One of our alumna, Kelly Donahue Wallace, she's become sort of the leading expert in the US of colonial prints and colonial book production. She's published extensively on prints. That's an area that needs more work. And there are some issues with printmaking in the colonial period that has to do with the fragility of paper, and there just aren't a lot of surviving prints. We have books, but it's kind of spotty. And it has to do with the nature of paper, and a lot of it is lost. Some of it survives, but each of these areas, depending on the media, presents different challenges that has to do with what is accessible, what survives, what doesn't, and what shape does it survive. But printmaking definitely is an area that needs more work. And then sculpture. Sculpture is kind of at the bottom. I mean, there's religious sculpture everywhere, but like no one does any serious work in sculpture in colonial art history. This is an area that needs, again, like printmaking, more work. You know, a lot of sculpture was destroyed, you know, over time for a number of reasons, but sculpture just hasn't really, and sculpture isn't really seen as that distinct from what we see happening in Spain. It seems that the works that get the most attention are the things that look really different, you know, from what's produced in Europe. You know, and the sculptural tradition in the Americas, although we have some indigenous sort of contributions, it's very similar to what we see, especially in Spain. You know, wooden figural sculptures that are painted with gold and then covered with stucco to emulate flesh. You know, it's very similar to what happens in Spain. So the attention to sculpture, again, has been spotty. This is one of the weak areas. A lot of the scholarship's been focused on architecture and painting. And then more recently, we're starting to see a lot of work. Biombos, you know, that's an area that also needs some work. Everybody knows what a biombo is. We've all seen them. But again, there hasn't been a lot of research on biombos. What we're starting to see is that there's a trans-Pacific connection with trade with Asia. The Philippines, for instance, were governed as a jurisdiction of New Spain. As distant as they were, they fell under the jurisdiction of New Spain in Mexico City. I want to talk a little bit more about the Trans-Pacific trade when we get to the Biombo. Okay? So let's move on.
Question.
Yes.
Okay. And this doesn't actually have to do with the course specifically, but so in in academia or history, why have these things not received the attention? Like when I was getting my master's in art history, I feel like because it was somewhat recent, so people are really starting to spread out. You know, I studied like Italian art specifically, and I felt like there's nothing that I can that will be new or novel. So people are recognizing that and starting to spread out a little bit. But what I'm wondering is why have these pieces and these when you're saying there hasn't been work done, that sounds really exciting to me. Why has this not been done?
Yeah, that's a question that has been engaged in recent years. Actually, my book, in my introduction, I talk about this. There was an exhibition a couple of years ago focused on images of the Virgin. And one of the essayists, she's a Spanish art historian, Elena Alcalá, addresses that issue. And what she suggests, and I have a couple of responses to this, and this is something that we're starting to look at, is the cultural politics, the way cultural politics in society actually inflect academic research. And what Elena Alcalá suggests is that a lot of the works that are canonical to colonial art tend to fall into the category of images, a history of images, not a history of art. She makes a distinction between history of images, history of art. Okay, and when you think about traditional art history, questions of, I guess, authorship, like biography, the author, there are issues of aesthetics and quality, connoisseurship, and some of these things don't apply to colonial art production. So her suggestion or her observation is that so much of colonial art falls into this other category and not into the category of art, which has informed why art historians, kind of working with Eurocentric sort of aesthetic ideas, look at this material as inferior. And that's been a criticism that had been aimed at colonial art for a very long time, that these were inferior copies of European art forms. You know, the idea was that the colonial context was not an original creative context. It was simply copying and then deficient. These were like deficient copies. But when you look at the colonial period, there's actually a lot of creativity. There's reinterpretation and creative blendings and negotiations of visual languages from different sources in a way that we don't see in Europe. And part of it is that there are no art academies. You know, the art academies in Europe regulate. They train artists and they regulate art production. We don't have art academies in the Americas until the 1780s. So for the majority of the colonial period, the artistic environment in the Americas is regulated by workshops with masters and apprentices and guilds. Okay, but what that means is without sort of a central regulating artistic institution, artists have more freedom to combine things, to be creative.
Because there are
Right, there are no academies overseeing what they're doing. You know, they're much more open to creative blendings of things. So we begin to see in the colonial period, as we move into the 17th century especially, art forms that have some European elements, but then there's something different about them. You know, certain religious iconographies, like there are certain saints that are popular in Spain are not popular over here. You know, there are different saints that disappear in Europe that take on new life over here. And this is all, these are all indices of the different societies. Their value systems are different. Their historical and cultural experiences are different. You know, so their art is going to reflect very different kinds of ideas than when we see. The Americas are not Europe. You know, European models are brought over and they're immediately changed. They're adapting to the local environment, the physical environment, and then I'm referring to materials, to color. They adapt to the cultural environment, to the psychological environment. We have native cultures that are present and alter what's brought over. The natives, for a very long time it was believed that the process that we see after conquest is acculturation, you know, where the dominant culture comes in and wipes everything out. And that, we realize now, is not true. So where earlier acculturation was seen as the dominant cultural process, that is Spanish come in and take over and erase the natives and just plop Spanish culture in the Americas, we now see that the term that more accurately captures what we see is transculturation. Okay, this is coming out of anthropology. Transculturation, that is that there are different exchanges in multiple directions from different cultures. So the Spanish material that's brought over is just as altered by what's here as what's here is altered by what's introduced. So the influences move in multiple directions. And then you add to that you have Asians with the Trans-Pacific trade. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later. But the Trans-Pacific trade is established officially in 1565. Okay, Spain arrives in the Philippines in the 1520s. There are multiple expeditions throughout the 1540s and 50s, but it's in 1565 that the official trade route is established using the trade winds and the currents. So from 1565 on, the Philippines are absorbed into the political jurisdiction of New Spain. Manila is settled by the Spanish. And through that port, you have not only goods and foods coming from Japan, the Philippines, but also China, Korea, what today is India. Goods through the Philippines make it to the Americas. And it's not just objects like furniture or textiles, people. We see migration to the Americas from Asia in the late 16th century. Then you have on the East Coast, Africans being brought in. Okay, different ethnic groups are coming in from the East Coast. So by the time you get to 1600, Mexico City is not only the largest city in the world, but it is racially diverse on a level that we don't see anywhere else. All corners of the globe are represented in Mexico City. You have primarily Iberians representing you, but you also have Italians and some people from the Netherlands, the religious people. Okay, then you have the different native ethnic groups that are already there. Then you have different Africans coming in. Then you have all these Asians coming in. So by 1600, this is a really cosmopolitan society. The city is large and it's diverse. And these different cultural influences that are brought by these people get integrated into all forms of cultural production, in the language, in the food, in the arts. Okay? And some of the pieces that I selected sort of demonstrate some of this, especially the screens in terms of Asia. Okay?
Thank you. So it's not really that the information isn't there.
Yeah.
Or the documentation or
Right.
things that people were not interested in it for its own right.
Well, yeah, so Elena, going back to what she said, it's like because of the unique nature of cultural intermingling and processes, it looks odd. It doesn't look like what Europeans think of as fine art. So that's one kind of structural explanation. Back in 2006, there was a large colonial exhibition that was traveling. It opened in Philadelphia. This is a very important source if you want to read more about colonial art. It was called Art of Colonial Latin America, 1520 to 1821. And it was curated by Joseph Rischel, who was a curator. I think he retired now. He was one of the curators at Philadelphia. The show spanned the entire historical period, all geographies, all media. Okay, and it was a major show, and the catalog is stupendous. It's stupendous. It's a wonderful resource, and the images are just stunning. And it opened in Philadelphia. I know it traveled to LACMA, and then it went down to Mexico City. The curators who worked with Joseph, one of them is Joanna Hecht, who was a curator at the Met. She was interviewed along with a few other scholars. It was in the spring 2010 issue of Art News. Spring 2010. You might want to take a look at that. Spring 2010 Art News. And it's about that show and colonial art. And Johanna mentions or observes that it is clear that one of the reasons why this material has been marginal in study is because it was because of racist and classist attitudes. That because of perceptions of the Hispanics in the US, and when you think about immigration, the people who come up to the US tend to be poor. And if you're poor, you tend to be indigenous or mixed race. These are the people in the US who aren't familiar with Latin America, they look at these populations and then they make generalizations. So Johanna suggests that classism and racism, people who don't know really the history of Latin America kind of look at the populations they're familiar with in the US who represent a very specific demographic coming from Latin America. I mean, wealthy people don't have a need to immigrate. They come to school at Harvard and Stanford. It's the poor people who are migrants, and they tend to be indigenous or of indigenous derivation. That's the population most Americans see as representative of Latin America. And there are judgments and generalizations made, and the judgment was that there is no high culture, there is no complexity. So that was an observation. It made me fall out of my seat when I read that, because those of us who work in the area were like, yeah. It's like we're aware of this. But to have someone like from the Met making this observation, yeah, it was really important for people to see that. So those are like the two main reasons. One has to do with the larger cultural politics of society, and the other one has to do with certain structural quirks of the discipline.
Right, my kids just asked that. I've got a strong Latino population
Yeah.
at our school, and a bunch of my kids just love this art because it's new and it's different and it's their culture.
Yeah.
Right? So, or their families from Peru or
Sure,
Mexico.
sure,
So,
yeah.
I
But
want to know what to tell them. When
yeah.
Where is this been?
Yeah, well, those are the two explanations that have been offered at this point, and some like in my book, in my introduction, I kind of go into more detail. I look at the history of this reception and try to explain what happened and why it's still marginal in our familiarity, not just in art history, but just in the general public's eye. It's just unknown. Every time there's a colonial exhibition, people are like, "Wow, I had no idea people made this kind of stuff." Well, there's a lot of stuff going on, and I wish I had more images in this particular section because there's some spectacular things that just didn't fit. We did design the curriculum to be updated periodically, so one of the hopes was that it would change, and at some point we might be able to add more things or replace a few works. So we'll see what happens.